Australia is a hotbed for tall building development right now. Melbourne in particular, I think. How did that come to be?
You're right. Melbourne particularly. It's being closely followed by Sydney. We had tall buildings in Melbourne, but they were mostly commercial. And what's happened recently is that there's a spate now of very tall residential buildings. I think Melbourne's attracted foreign investment, foreign development, because it's a safe haven, economically, culturally. It's a great place to be. And there's demand. There's just continuing demand. We don't know how much longer that will go, but you know the experts tell us that there's quite a lot of future in and need in residential typology within the city.
And for an Australian architect like yourself, how does that affect your work? Is it the presence of all this global capital make new kinds of projects feasible?
Well, interestingly, we, way back in the 90s, got involved with bringing residential into the city, and it was quite new in those days. So, in a way, we've been sought out to keep doing that. So whether we like it or not, and by the way, we love it, we've definitely been doing a lot of residential work, but the scale of the work is getting bigger and taller.
Mm-hmm. And as it gets bigger and taller, how should architects and planners in Melbourne, Sydney, other Australian cities make sure that their towers are globally relevant but still locally appropriate?
Look, I think with any tall building, and obviously tall buildings make the city, they are the visible components of the city. So the taller they are, the bigger they are, the more presence they have, the more it's important for an architect to make them a building that's compelling, that's sculptural, that engages the public, that becomes a talking point, part of the legend of a city. It's also important, I think, that those towers come down to ground appropriately, that there's no wind downdrafts that cause problems for pedestrians, that there is activity and life at the base of the building, which keeps the whole pedestrian realm rich and interesting.
And speaking of the pedestrian realm, how are these towers that are currently out there or in development, how are you as an architect making sure that the pedestrian experience, that the context of the urban context of Melbourne is viable, is still livable, even with development happening faster than ever?
It's bred into us. We live in Melbourne. We've seen Melbourne grow. We've been part of the growth. It's part of our kit of parts. We do it without thinking. We know we must. So it's an imperative for us.
And particularly, I mean, specifically, how do you do that?
Well, you have to bring clients along quite often because sometimes giving back to the city means a little less saleable area. But we're assisted in that regard by the authorities. The authorities really drive actively engaged buildings in the ground plane. And so bringing clients to authorities, having proper workshops, etc., normally we get there.
Mm-hmm. You said the city, the authority helps, so that would be the planning agencies?
Definitely, yeah.
How do they help exactly?
Well, the planning agencies have been taken a little bit by surprise by the rapid growth, and so they've had to take stock of the city very, very quickly. They realise that the beauty of Melbourne, particularly, which was an early 20th century city, but actually started in the 19th century, was low-scaled, activated, and they realised that they had to keep that sort of flavour in the ground, make it a place that was always habitable and interesting for the public.
Tell me about this air plant study at the Eureka Tower.
That was just a little study by an artist and a horticulturalist to look at ways of growing plants and finding plants, air plants, that would work in height on buildings. These are plants that actually don't need maintenance, somehow don't need water, don't need soil, and so they were put a test bed of plants up there to see how they'd go, and they'd monitored their survival rates and their health rates.
And what sort of applications do you think could be used on tall buildings?
Well, interestingly, tall buildings have, still have horizontal surfaces. Some of our towers have shoulders which have horizontal surfaces. Eureka does. Australia 108 does. Roofs, of course. And the City Council actually has a campaign to green all of those roofs. It's quite sustainable. It helps insulate the buildings. Greening the city looks beautiful. It's outdoor space for people to occupy. And if you can find plants that minimise the maintenance, then you're halfway there on making those environments sustainable and long-lasting.
When it comes to incorporating greenery and living walls and living materials into your built projects, what sort of things are you personally interested in and exploring right now?
Well, again, I think it comes to the ground plane. So we quite often integrate planting, trees, shade, creepers, etc., into the base of our buildings. That's not necessarily Patrick Blanc type hanging green walls, but just plants that are quite sustainable, quite large, provide shelter, protection from wind, protection from sun, and just make the whole ground level experience much richer.
Do you think with the incorporation of greenery and some of the other elements that have been ascribed to tall buildings in Australia, that there's emerging some sort of Australian tall building archetype or identity? And if so, what is it?
Again, I think it comes to the base of the buildings, because towers are towers. They have a role to fill. They have to be clad in certain ways. They are structured in certain ways. Yes, there's room to make them sculptural, and I think a lot of the towers in Melbourne are quite sculptural and interesting. But the real character of the city is done at the ground plane. That's where people engage. That's where it has to work in the local culture.
Mm-hmm. And what examples in Melbourne could you point to that have a really fantastic interface on the ground level, or that have some innovative context there?
Well, let me talk about one of our buildings called Eureka. It takes a city block. It has a solely residential tower. It's 300 metres tall, the tallest residential floor plate in Australia, actually. But it sits on a city block. The city block also has a hotel, it has retail, it has a palm courtyard, it has a linkage from one side of the site to the other, like a laneway, and that's very much in the character of Melbourne and its rediscovered laneways. So it's trying to work very hard at knitting the pedestrian patterns at ground level. It's got palm trees which are quite interesting and sculptural and really make a special place to be. It's got the entry off that palm court to a sky deck, so it's always full of people, school kids, conglomerating, waiting to go up. And it's mixed use, so it's very much about engaging, creating opportunities, and really knitting the neighbourhood together.